Hi, this is Trev and welcome to my blog. Welcome to part 19 of my Bedford CA van restoration. It's been a while, hasn't it? It's been a while for a very good reason. I decided to wrap this van block up with just 2 more parts. So this is part 19, the penultimate episode. Second from last. Oh my god, Trev, when's the next van block coming? Well, don't worry folks, it's here and now. Let's go and check it out. Once I'd taken the decision to weld up the vent flap in the bulkhead, I realised that this opened up some space and immediately thought of a washer bottle. So I sourced myself a nice washer bottle. It was from a Corsa C, 2.2 litres, and it fits in that hole absolutely perfect. I finished off the inner flitch welding now. So both inner flitches, both sides, driver and passenger side, have both been fabricated and welded in. The other thing I've done as well is the hole on the front panel which allows the air to travel up the tunnel. I've blanked that off because in the winter there's going to be freezing air rushing at that hole and freezing at my washer bottle. I've made a repair section for the end of the front panel where the outer front panel bolts to the inner. That had completely rotted out, so I've done that. The lower inner flitch on the driver's side, I've made a bolt-in panel. I can remove this panel to gain access to the steering transfer box. I've also repeated the same procedure on the passenger side because with this panel removed I can gain easy access to the powered steering pump and the water pump. I've got the panel out as far as it'll go. The old tyre just misses it on a full lock, so it's been very close. Shot from the inside showing the fabrication of the inner flitch. I've had to move the bracket again on my powered steering reservoir, so I've made another new bracket up to bring the reservoir out even further. It only just about misses the radiator now, but it misses fine. This means that it now redirects the fluid around the flitch a little bit better because this pipe was unfortunately resting against the flitch the way it was before. So I've managed to get the flitch over as far as I can without it rubbing the tyre, which has allowed me a tiny gap. I think there's enough gap there for engine movement. I've got quite a big gap, get my fingers in there anyway, so. I haven't blanked the hole up on the passenger side for the air to go up inside that tunnel because the air that goes inside here will blast through and take the heat away from the exhaust manifold. So that's why I've left this side open. I've also made a small repair section for the end of the inner front panel for where the outer front panel bolts on, so I've done that as well. So this is the 1.8 Zetec engine that you've seen me fitting in the van. This is the engine that I've used right from the start. I bought this before I bought the donor car, and I very soon realised that I really needed to buy a complete car to get the petrol tank off, the wire and loom and all the other bits and pieces that I was going to need to run the engine. Now this engine was reputed to have done 59,000 miles from new, and it looks like it's done more than that, and there was no way of proving otherwise. It's also got a noisy water pump, and it just generally looks like it's done a lot of miles. Now the donor car has done a lot of miles, I know that. It's done 130,000 miles, but I also have a full service history with it, and it recently had a cam belt done. It's done 130,000 miles, but it sounds as sweet as a nut. I've had it running on the drive, and it runs very well. I revved the nuts out of it. I didn't get any smoke out of the exhaust. There was no nasty rattles or knocks or anything like that. So I thought, well, why don't I just fit this engine, because I know that it's a good one. I got to go to a lot of trouble to fit the other one just to find out that it might be no good whatsoever. I've made up this jig, and it bolts to the front axle, and it also bolts to the engine where the sump would bolt to the underside of the aluminium part of the sump. Now I've done this so that when I remove the engine I can then re-bolt this jig back to the front axle or cross member, whatever you want to call it. With the engine then removed, this jig will tell me exactly where the steel sump needs to be bolted, because I can bolt the steel sump in exactly the same place through these holes, and I'll know then where to cut the axle in relation to where the engine would have been. When I then bolt the engine back in finally at the end, I'll have an exact cutout of where the sump needs to go. So I'm not going to cut too much out, and I'm not going to be in a position where I haven't cut enough out. All the modifications to the front axle have now been made. I've welded some 3mm thick steel plate in between the rack mounting points, and this area is very high in relation to the top of the axle. This means that the back is very nicely strengthened, not only by the rack that's very strong and bolted in there already, but by this plate that's been welded in as well. It's all different angles, it's all very thick, so this definitely puts the strength back into the rear of the axle. However, I feel that the front is slightly vulnerable because it's very shallow now. This has got a 3mm thick steel plate welded in as well. I've also welded in a bit of scaffold tube where the oil drain is on the new sump. So what I've done to strengthen the front up is I've made this brace, I don't know, I expect 10mm thick, and that bolts in 6 places onto the axle at the front like that to put the strength back in that's removed from the front of the axle. Something that I've been looking forward to do for quite some time now is to make this fascia up that's going to act as a door to the access that's behind the dashboard. Now, because this is an early CA and it's got a very shallow screen, it means that the void behind the dash is really large, because the later ones of course had a taller screen and the dash was a lot smaller, so I've got this big void behind the dashboard that I can utilise to swallow up all of that wiring that I'm going to need to consume inside the dash, and the access panel, hopefully, the plan is, I can fit a fuse box behind there. So I can just take the access panel off and there's the fuse box. This is the plan anyway at the moment. Now I got the idea from a chap called Martin Campbell. Now Martin Campbell, he took a binnacle from the driver's side, the instrument cluster, and what he did is he made it shorter, so he made it shorter, and it looks, in the pictures anyway, it looks a lot thinner. And I think he's got speakers mounted in his. It just looks like a glove box, but in the same style as the binnacle. But because he's made it smaller, it's really clever because it doesn't look the same as the binnacle, which would look a bit daft really. I mean, if you just had it a huge binnacle like that, it'd look an exact duplicate of what's on the driver's side. And so this is what I intend to do. So what I'm going to do is I'll make it up first before I cut the hole. So I'll make it up and then I'll offer it up. I'll cut the largest hole I can like I say, to gain access to what's going to be behind, and that'll be my next job. So I'll make it up and we'll see where we are then. How cool does that look? That's absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. What I've done is I've taken the script badge off the dash, the same as Martin had done. So I've nicked that idea as well, Martin. So thank you very much. This panel here, the solid panel, it won't look like this when it's finished because I'm going to have some sort of speaker gauze or some speaker fabric over the top of that, and I plan at a later date to make some holes in this so that I can have some speakers behind as well. But that's a job for another time. Let's just get the van done now. Now, the reason it's going to be black is for another reason I'm not going to go into anymore because I don't want to confuse you anymore. Is it too late for me to say goodbye? So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to fit that comedy moment, fit that on there. So that's going to go there. That's just so cool, so cool. I'll make my hole up, and now that this is made, I can make the hole accurately, and I think I am going to have it bolted in, just bolted there, and then it'll match the other side as well, and it's a lot easier. So that'll be my next job. This is as far along the line as I'm going to go with this job now. Just drop the binnacle back in and you've got the glove box on so you can see it. Side by side, I'll show you from the other side now. You can see in this shot how much larger that instrument panel looks now against the glove box. I've cut the access hole, taking great care to make sure that the glove box is the same height as the binnacle on the other side, because that would have been easy to get wrong. Make sure it's sort of lined up well as well. Lots of access now so that I can gain access inside of the dash, so I can fit that huge wiring loom up inside there and also mount the fuse box from behind. I'm really pleased with the way this has turned out, and also it's very rigid still. around the aperture. I was expecting to have to reinforce it, which I don't have to do at all now. I've got a couple of M6 clips with some nice long bolts. These bolts kind of look like the Zeus clips that are on the original binnacle, so it all ties in really nicely. One thing I just mention is I put a lip on the back of my glove box. The purpose of this lip is so that I can secure a self-adhesive seal, and then when this thing goes up against the dash and seals against the dash, you won't see the seal from the outside and it'll just look lovely and flush. So that's why I fitted that lip on the back. Something that I've been meaning to do for a long time is address my wiper issue. My spindles are completely ruined and the spindles seem to be completely unobtainable. I was chatting online to a guy called Ian Cowlishaw who just fitted an MGB GT wiper system to his CA successfully. So I contacted him, and a very nice chap, helped me out, gave me lots of advice, so thank you very much, Ian. What I also particularly like about this system is the fact that I'm going to pack my dash full of wiring, and the wiring can lie up against the system as there are no external moving parts. Unlike the Bedford, it means that there's no chance of the moving part then wearing through my loom and causing big issues. So this is something else that's attracted me to this type of system for my application. So this is what I'm going to fit next. I've got the first wheel box fitted, not too many problems, just had to file a load off the bezel. That's the original bezel, and that's the filed down one underneath, you can see. So I'll do the other side next. The plastic spacer that goes under the wheel box is completely the wrong shape, so I've just used this rubber packer for now. I'll have to get some more spacer and cut it to the right shape, but this will do for just getting it to fit for now. I'm just about to fit the wheel box on the passenger side, and I realised I forgot to mention that I had to drill the hole out because the MG wheel boxes are far larger than the original Bedfords, and I had to drill the hole out to 17mm. I decided to go for a set of mini wiper blades as they bend the other way to MG ones, which means that they park on the correct side for the van as they would have done originally. So I've bought this set of blades and arms in stainless steel. I went for 11-inch blades because they clear that little bit more of the screen. Problem I've got with this immediately is, although they look really nice, is when they come to the top of the screen, they overlap the screen rubber by quite a bit. Now, had I gone for 10-inch blades, it still would have hit. So what I've got to do is I've got to reduce the length of this arm. And the way I intend doing this is by knocking these two rivets out, drilling some fresh holes, making a new bend on the end for the spring, because it's sprung as well, just to add complications. So that's what I'm going to do next.
In this little corner of the Catskills, which are very beautiful.
You do.
Here's my shortened arm. And it fits really nicely now. With both wiper arms now cut down, the next thing I've got to do, and I was completely aware of this before I even started this job, is I realised that the wipers were, of course, much further apart than they would have been on the MG. And this is the original MG wiper spindle and tube setup, and you can see how much closer together they are. So I've bought this second tube assembly so that I can join the tubes together to make a longer length. And then of course the rack's too short as well, and you can actually buy a rack that's 1.5 meters long and cut it down. So this is what I've done. Now, sod's law, this tube, if you cut the end off, it's still not long enough. So I'm going to have to borrow a little bit off this one as well. So I'm going to end up with 3 sections of tube all married together to make up the length to go from spindle to spindle. So this is my next job. Well, I've had a bit of luck with these rack tubes. I've managed to get away with just using the 2 centre tubes which join the original MGB wiper spindle to spindle together, because I'm not following the shape of the front panel which I was originally, the dash panel, front panel, and I've managed to cut the ends, the flared ends, off the tubes and then join them together with a plumber's 8mm compression fitting. I haven't over tightened this because the tubes are quite thin. If I over tighten it, it'll crush the tube and then the rack won't go through afterwards. I'll show you the rack I've bought now. This is the MG wiper motor with its attached original rack, which is much too short for my application. Besides it is the 1.5 metre long rack that I've bought. They're all universal, these Lucas racks, so this will fit in any of the motors. It's 1.5 metres long, which is much too long. But once I fed it through the tubes, there'll be the excess sticking out, and you can simply cut this off with a pair of wire cutters. Something else worth mentioning quickly is the fact that these motors park, and the motor's in its parked position, which means that the rack is fully out. The side plate on the motor's got an arrow pointing out with a park symbol on there, meaning that this is the way it parks. So this is an important consideration when you're thinking about how the wipers are going to park on the van. The wipers park on the Bedford CA on the passenger side. So the consideration I've made is to place the motor on the passenger side, because it's in its parked position. The first thing that's going to happen when you turn the wipers on is the rack's going to be withdrawn, so it's going to pull, which means that the wheel box that's attached to the rack is going to turn anti-clockwise first. That means that the spindle will turn anti-clockwise and the wiper that's attached is going to go up the screen in an anti-clockwise motion before it returns back down to the park position. I've got the motor mounted down in that corner, which leaves me quite a bit of access still to get behind the dash. Well, it's really nice to see those wipers up and running at last. The next project I intend to do is to look at these mirrors. So what I've ended up fitting is this Type 2 Volkswagen bus mirror. It was the only mirror I could find that I half liked. Nothing original available that I could find that would go in the original 3-hole mounting. I found some 2-hole stuff, but ridiculous prices just for little bits and pieces, so I thought, well, £20 a pair for these mirrors. I've made a mount up that I've welded to the van permanently. It's got a threaded hole in it, so if this mirror gets bashed off at any time, I can just wind it out, throw it away, buy a new mirror, wind it straight back in. It would very much seem that any parts that weren't removed from the van are completely knackered, and something that was removed from the van are the demister vents that go behind the dash. So what I've done is I've bought the Citroen 2CV demister vents. They look to be the right shape. Unfortunately, they're absolutely massive. I've still used them, and this is what I've ended up doing. That's the one I've cut down for the passenger side and made it fit around the mini wheel box. I suppose at the end of the day, I don't know whether the original ones would have fitted around the wiper box, although they probably would have done. So I've made this up anyway. I've got to do the driver's side yet. I'll probably make that a slightly different shape on the driver's side. Leaf springs. A picture tells 1,000 words. No explanation needed. I've had both rear leaf springs shot blasted, and I'm epoxy coating them like this one here. They'll be then greased, of course, before they're reassembled. I'm going to have the axle casing done exactly the same, and also all of the associated suspension parts will be done exactly the same. When I was taking the rear suspension apart, I had to cut through the U-bolts to get them off because they were so badly corroded. I was really fortunate because I managed to get hold of another set of U-bolts, 7/16 spec as well, which is quite nice, as N10 stuff seems to be in abundance, but it isn't as thick. I've bought a full set of shackle bushes as well, but I've got another problem. The shackle pins are completely worn out and the threads have seen better days as well. Now you can't buy these, well I certainly haven't found them from anywhere, so what I've had to do is have some new ones made up. These are 1/2 inch bar, turned down to 7/16 and threaded on the end as per the original spec. Thank you very much Steve for getting these sorted for me, much appreciated. So as you can appreciate, with new bushes and new pins, it should last a long while before it needs any more attention. This is the completed demister blower fittings. They're all finished, so they negotiate the instrument on the driver's side and the wiper mechanism. I've also fitted 2 blower outlets into the cab. That's the one on the passenger side, and on the driver's side I've plumbed it into the original channel. It's the 2nd of February 2017. It's 9:30 in the morning and I'm at a pivotal moment with the van. I'm as far along the line as I can go with regards to modifications, and what this really means is that everything I do to the van from now on means that the van will be going back together again permanently and not being taken apart. So everything's off it, the front and rear axles have been stripped off, and all the little welding jobs have been done to the chassis, all the little welding jobs. So yeah, I'm as far along as I can go. I'm really chuffed to have got to this stage. This stage means a lot to me because, like I say, from now on it's going back together and not coming apart. So what am I doing next? Well, I'm going to give this chassis a good rub down now that it's completely stripped out, and give it a good coat of epoxy, and that'll be the next stage.
Committee says councils need to find new ways to maintain open spaces that are at risk of falling into neglect as they help people stay fit and healthy. BBC
wishes come true, more of that in a minute. Bedford and I've got a question here from Deborah. Do you still keep your embroidered signature table?
For signatures, she'd get them to write on the pen when they left after tea, and then I took that up, and so now if I remember it and I have it on me.
Just reconditioning the new rear axle I've got for the van, and I've just welded on this second brake pipe bracket because it's going to have the twin brake system on it. Just knocked the old oil seals out, and I've got some new oil seals to go in, and I've also got a new pinion seal as well. I'm busy rebuilding the front axle, and putting the wishbones on isn't as straightforward as I first thought it was going to be. One of the issues I've got is where I've painted the wishbones, I've got paint inside the threads, so I had to clean the threads out before I could get the fulcrum brush to wind into the arm properly. The fulcrum brush has got two threads, one on the outside and one on the inside. The outside threads actually bite into the wishbone itself. So the top arm, what you've got to do, you've got to set the top arm up so that you're winding the threads in exactly the same distance each side. What this has a tendency of doing then is the threads that bite into the wishbones don't bite in quick enough, which means that you slightly, only very slightly, compress that fork in. And what this does is it then twists the bush on the threads, the inner threads, it twists them slightly, which means that the arm goes tight. I couldn't work out what was happening. I had several attempts at this, and how I've overcome it myself is, as I'm winding it in, if I just lightly hold some pressure so that the fork spreads slightly, it encourages the thread to bite quicker into the arm, and you want to end up with a result like this. I'm only doing this video in case someone else is doing this, not really just because of what I'm doing, but just to help someone else along if they've gonna strip theirs down for whatever reason. So you want to end up with something that's got absolutely no tightness at all in it, and these have been torqued up to 60 pounds-feet. I'll show you the lower one next. Well worth getting yourself this manual if you see it. A friend of mine got me this, and it's got details of how to set the fulcrum bushes up. So the lower arm needs to be held in a horizontal position to start with. We go to the rear fulcrum bush, and what I've done is I've made myself up a spacer. It's 1.66 inch spacer, and that sits in between the inner face of the wishbone and the boss that the inner threaded part sits against. So there's like a big boss there, it sits in there, sits against that. That spaces that out so that it gets the distance in right. And then what you do is you wind in your fulcrum bush with that spacer in there so that it can't pinch up or be too wide, so you know that it fits nicely. Then you just simply wind the other side in. Once again, if the thread doesn't bite into the arm, then it locks it up solid. I've had it both top and bottom where I've tightened them up, and then it's quite stiff to move the arm up and down. Like I said, it's because it's pinched this in slightly, which is causing the bush to twist, and then you're binding those threads up inside, and what you want it to end up is it being able to fall under its own weight. I would have said, you see there's absolutely no resistance on that at all, and the same with the top, there's no resistance there. It's all been cleaned out. I've got all the old gunge out of there, cleaned it thoroughly, and then I've put some fresh graphite and lithium grease in there, packed it full of that, so should last for a good few years now. The other thing I've done is fitted new rubber seals on the back so that when the grease goes in there, it has a tendency to spill out the back, and that holds that up against the back of the thread and stops the grease from coming out. Before I bolt the steering rack in for its final time, I thought I'd just fit a set of brand new tie rods and trap rod ends. Gotta be worth doing at this stage. Bought a complete set of wheel cylinders off eBay, front and rear, and the rear wheel cylinders came with retaining clips and bleed nipples for the rear. First slight annoyance was the fact that there were no bleed nipples for the front. Hadn't realised this till I came to fit them, and then of course I had to delay fitting them till I got some bleed nipples. So I ordered those. The next problem I had was the holes on the front were slightly out, so I had to file my backing plates to get these to actually fit into the cutout. When I got them fitted, the very next issue I had when I came to bleed the brakes was that where the crush washer seals against the back of the cylinder, because that's the type of brake lines that I've ordered that have arrived anyway. I ordered them for the CA and they come with crush washers which seal against the back of the cylinder. This is rough cast and also completely the wrong shape, so I've had to file a new flat on here to ensure that the crush washer seals, because both sides were leaking out fluid. And unbelievably I had another problem, and this was the fact that the hole for the bleed nipple hadn't been drilled through. So I had to strip the cylinder down on the passenger side and drill the hole through myself. I'm as far along the line as I want to go for now, and then it's engine in time. Thought I'd just shoot this quick video to give you an overview of what's been going on over the last couple of months. I completely removed all of the paint from the front end, the dashboard up inside, the bulkhead, the inner wings, the engine bay, everything. Back to bare metal. It's been epoxy primered and epoxy coated in some places, and the bay's all been painted ready for the wiring and the engine to go back in. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what I've been up to, because I could make a whole 3/4 of an hour show just on this front axle, perhaps another 3/4 of an hour on all the tales of woe with getting the brakes working, and it's going to go on too much. If you've got a specific question, just send me an email. I'll do my best to help you out, like a couple of people have done their best to help me out, most namely Andrew, of course. Andrew, thanks for that. There's this stabiliser bar, rubber mounted now, so thank you, mate. That's all done and dusted, and the axle's back together, about 80% finished, I'd say. All the brakes are done. No shockers fitted yet, but I've got new shocks to go on. Haven't fitted the anti-roll bar, but it's all ready to go back on. I've just painted loads of bits actually, so it's all drying out. Used tons of this epoxy coating, tons and tons of it. I reckon I'll have used about 10 litres by the time I get to the end. And I cannot stress how much extra hard work and aggravation it is to get stuff shot blasted and then coat it properly, as opposed to just shooting the underseal gun round. So show you the brakes now. So just to recap, Ford Focus brakes essentially, Ford Focus modified pedal box, and servo and master cylinder, and that obviously isn't Ford Focus, that's of a Transit, and there's been some modification needed to fit that reservoir off that Transit, because this is the standard Focus one, which is wrong size, wrong shape, because the Focus brakes servo is fitted on a pretty strong sort of 30-degree slant, so that's why this is the shape it is. Then there's no space for a reservoir, so there's a pipe that goes off to that to another bottle which holds the fluid. Bit impractical from what I want to do, so I thought, well, I'll just adapt things so that I can put this nice big Transit one in, floor in there, flap, you know, open the flap, gain access to this. Also got me a low level warning system on there, and it's dual circuit, meaning that if the wheel cylinder was to fail on any one of the brakes, you've still got brakes, because it's split across the axles. So the passenger side rear axle is joined to the driver's side front, and that's why it's got this extra pipe running up the chassis. So if you had one of the wheel cylinders blow and you lost all your fluid, you're still going to have across the axles 2 of the brakes still working, which gives you more chance of stopping than nothing at all. This rear axle, as I said, it went together far easier than the front. Still a hell of a lot of work, but I didn't have the problems that I had with the front end. Thankfully, I fitted everything as much new as I possibly could. I would have loved to have fitted new leaf springs as well, but what's the chances of getting those? So that's it. Overview complete. Let's see what we're going to do about getting an engine in there.
In the ground. Devil took my pig and he spit in his eye. Even covered my milk and my cow went dry. My hens won't lay and my ducks won't quack. The devil around my chicken shack. Oh, you and my devil make a terrible pair. Make me jump out my long underwear. The devil was a laughing about a game he played. Took a case on fire and put it out with a spade.
It's extremely frustrating, but the starter I've bought won't fit. It's for a Pinto. It would fit if I spaced it back by 14mm. If I do this, it then hits the front axle, so I can't use it now. So I've got to try and resell this, along with many other parts that I've already bought that are wrong. I've had the battery on charge and it's all wired up. I've just lashed the wiring loom up that I took off the car. I'd already reduced the amount of bulk, so I've just put it back on as it is, and there's plenty to remove. I've tried to start the engine and it wouldn't fire up, and the main reason it wouldn't fire up is because I got the fuel lines on the wrong way round. I discovered that I had no pressure in the rail by means of that valve there, and that told me I had no fuel in the rail, so I dribbled a bit of fuel down the throttle body and it fired up. So I'm pretty confident that it will fire up now, so let's see what happens. Okay, right, here goes then. Okay, so now that I've had a little lie down to recover, what's next? Well, I've got loads and loads of bulk that I need to get rid of. I've got this central fuse box. The only useful thing I can see that's on there is this starter relay. So if I can reduce all this down to just that. There's also something called a battery saver relay. I don't know what it does, but hey, yeah, I'll look into that. So there's just this plug that goes to the box, which is to do with feeding the relay, and it's confusing because it says in the wiring diagram I've got, it says that the green and yellow wire goes to number 1 pin on the relay. There's 2 green and yellow wires, so I need to trace these back to see what they actually do. I put a meter across them and they actually join together anyway when this is plugged in, so there's every chance that if I join them together then join them to number 1, things are going to work fine. I'm not going to talk you through every single piece of what I've got to do because it's going to be vast, isn't it, to get rid of all this lot. You can see the amount of cables I've got to deal with. Again, there's a little LED. There's a little LED which gives you the status of the ECU. You've got all these wires. You only need 1 wire or 2 wires for that LED to light up. So I'll isolate the wires, take the LED out of there, or get another LED light, put it somewhere in the dashboard. So this is what I'm going to do next. I'm going to reduce the bulk and I'll pick up the video once I've done that. One of the biggest issues with keeping the standard fuel injection from the Focus and using it in something else is that you've got a speed sensor which reports back to the ECU how fast the car's going, and this drives the speedometer. But what the ECU also does is it calculates the amount of fuel the engine needs as regards to whether it's stationary or running. So you've got this sensor set inside the Focus gearbox. You've got this fingered wheel, and this pulses, this magnetic switch, telling the car that it's in motion. Now I need to retain this because I'm retaining the original ECU and fuel injection. So what I've done is I've bought a Speedo head off a Capri or a Sierra, I can't remember which one it was now, and I've done away with all the clock and everything, don't need any of that, just wanted this mechanical device. I've spot welded a disc on the back of the wheel and little hole in it. It would be secured onto this Speedo head drive, and this will be driven off the Type 9 gearbox. So we've got the Speedo cable driving this mechanism, driving this wheel. I've hollowed this out so that I can store a new cable going to my new speedometer. Now what I've done, I've got the original Bedford binnacle, my CA binnacle. It's quite nice condition. I didn't want to mess around with this, so what I've done is I've managed to pick one up for a tenner off eBay. Nice guy, I think his name was Chris. I could have gassed him for hours. We got on really well, and I bought this just at the road in Gloucester, and what I intend to do is fill this panel in, and then I'm changing the clock setup slightly from the standard on the CA. I want to just change the look of it slightly, So the clocks are all obsolete now. This is seized up anyway, so I thought what I'd use this for is I'd use the old Speedo housing for my new sensor housing. So I can mount that in there, mount the disc in there. This disc will turn, and then there's no chance of it getting tangled up with any wiring. And then the cable will come out the end, and it will drive the Speedo. So I have a mechanical Speedo still running off the gearbox, but it will be turning this disc, which will be telling the ECU that the car is in motion. Now I don't know how speed sensitive this is. I wouldn't have thought it would be that sensitive, because you could be doing 50 miles an hour in second gear or 50 miles an hour in fifth gear, and there's nothing telling the ECU what gear you're in. So I'm not 100% sure how sensitive it's going to be to speed. What I've done is I've worked out that on the Type 9 gearbox, on the output shaft turns once, and the Speedo drive turns the Speedo drive turns once, and the output shaft turns 3 times. So it's geared down, at least it's not geared up. And diff ratios, you know, you're talking about sort of anywhere from the mid 3s up to the sort of low 5s on average. So I would have thought 3 to 1 would probably be about 30% out. So it's not going to be far out. I mean, the car's going to be thinking you're doing 40 when you're doing about 30. And I would have thought for what I need it for, just telling the ECU that the car's in motion, I wouldn't have thought it would make that much difference. If it does, I'll have to sort of gear it down a little bit more, or do something with it. Well, drive it first and see what happens. The electronic Speedo drive finished and connected to the rear of the mechanical Speedo, so it drives both the electronic and the Speedo from the Speedo cable that comes from the Type 9 gearbox. You see the discs spinning inside. It works well. The electronic Speedo jumps up as soon as you take your foot off the clutch in gear, so it all seems to be working properly, and the revs changed on the engine as well. So I've got my new instrument cluster made and the new warning lights that I'm wiring in. I'm using the old Focus instrument cluster as an interface, because I'm not sure whether this feeds back to the ECU, but I've got the things like warning lights that aren't going to work without this, because it's got a microprocessor inside which turns the warning lights off. So what I've done is I've piggybacked off the back of the PCB of the instrument cluster. I've just taken the live feeds off the wires, which go back to my new lights up in there. They're LEDs on there. Problem is, the oil pressure one doesn't work. It doesn't go out. I'm assuming that it relies upon a load from the bulb. So if I put the original bulb back in, it works fine. So this is what I'm going to do now. So there's the bulb holder that plugs into the back of the printed circuit board. You see it's pretty tiny. I've taken that apart, taken the little brass fittings out of it, and there's the little brass fitting. There's 2 of them, and I've managed to solder a wire on the back of that. Thank heavens for reading glasses. Then I've got the bulb that would normally go into it, and I've managed to solder a couple of wires onto the back of that, and that's going to go up inside the warning lamp holder. Just the lens really. I've taken the LED out, and so with the LED inside the light, it will look like that on the dash. They're quite nice, aren't they? So let's get it all back together again and see if it works. So the wiring's done. Got the positive and negative feed off this oil pressure warning light switch. I'm assuming it's got a switched earth that has to go through the microprocessor, because if I just use a common earth off the van, it doesn't work. The light still stays on, so I'm not sure. I haven't tested it yet, but there's the warning light, which is going to go to my new binnacle. What else I've been up to? Well, I got rid of the central fuse box, reduced the central fuse box down to the starter relay and 3 fuses. One of the fuses is switched, the other 2 are permanent, or the other way around, can't remember now. And this is the wiring diagram I made up to get rid of the central fuse box, just in case anybody else is stupid enough to attempt what I've done. This will save you a lot of brain ache, so you can freeze the picture and have a good look at that. What's left to do? Well, I've got the lighting circuit left to do yet, and I intend to use the original engine fuse box utilising the relays off there. Of course, I'm using all new switches, so the old switches will all be binned. That flashing LED there is the status of the PAS, which I'll wire into the binnacle as well. Let's see if this oil pressure light goes out now. If this works, then that's done, and I can do the lighting circuit next. So if I put the camera there. That's the result. Right, lighting next. I've decided to use the main fuse box to run the lighting circuit, as the relays and circuits within the fuse box already exist, and I'm just causing myself loads and loads of work by making something from scratch. Also, it's nice and compact, keep it all in the same box. Now, I've done away with the central fuse box, of course, and a lot of the lighting fuses went through the central fuse box, and it needed such complicated fuses and systems because it was a very complicated system initially. Within the Focus, you've got these switches just for the headlights, and I'm just going to be using this little switch here. And looking at the wiring diagrams on the lighting, they are vast, and they have multiple fuses supplying different circuits, which I can get away with a lot of this because I'm just using my simple switch. So I've looked at the this fuse box, and I've identified that we've got a main beam, a dip and a side light relay, and corresponding output fuses to the headlights. So you've got one for dip, one for main beam on both headlights, and there we've got the side light fuse. This is outgoing, so I'm going to have to build in some kind of fused supply for the switch, which I intend to do within the fuse box, because we've got fuses up here, ABS, don't need that anymore, so I could ditch these fuses, put a lower rated fuse on, cut the wires at the back, and resolder them, relabel them so I know what I'm doing afterwards. And I'll see if I can get some output out of these fuses first. Here we are looking at the rear of the fuse box now. Same fuse box that I just showed you, just flipped over. It looks far more complicated than it is because we've got this massive wires everywhere. I've identified that these are the relay inputs. They're 5-pin relays, and it's all wired in ready. So we've already got the earth supply, we've already got the live feed, and we've already got the fuse wired in. This is why I'm doing this. I've got this probe, and this supply a positive or a negative charge. It also tells me what's going on. Whatever I probe that on, it'll tell me. I've got it wired to this side light bulb. So number 1 pin on the relays, which are all numbered on the back. Can't see it there obviously, but they're all numbered on the back. So if I probe number 1, see it's lit up, we've got an output. Give it a positive feed and lighten it up, no problem. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. What do you think then, Rodders? Cushy. Got the wiring loom as far along as I can go now. All the lighting circuits and wiper circuits have all been completed. I cannot finish it off because the inside of the van still needs finishing and the outside needs finishing as regards to mounting exterior lighting and things like that. So I'm going to stop now. I've got my partition panel fitted that I made up with the heater mounted to it, and this nice bulkhead fitting that also reduces the pipe from 5/8 to 1/2 inch. So I'm going to turn my attention next to putting the front of the van back together, putting the radiator in and everything else. Now, I mentioned in a previous clip that the donor car owner had told me that he'd had it regularly serviced and also had a cam belt change at some stage. So I dug out all the receipts that he supplied, and it turns out the cam belt was fitted in 2007. Now Ford recommend a cam belt change every 80,000 or every 10 years, whichever comes first. So 10 years ago, it makes complete sense to me to put a cam belt on this vehicle before I put the front panel back on, because if the belt lets go, it's going to be loads of hassle. So what I've done is I've invested in a new Gates cam belt kit with tensioner, idler pulley, new water pump, new auxiliary belt, new thermostat housing and a new radiator, and for the price I think it's well worth fitting. So that's what I'm going to do next. This is going to fight me every step of the way. The old radiator fits. The new one, the core's a bit thicker, doesn't go in. What's more, I've just gone and cut some plastic bits off the back, so this is now fit for the bin, unfortunately. Besides the fact that the radiator core is quite a bit thicker than the original one, the tanks are a lot thicker, but the main problem is the posts are in the wrong place. The mounting posts are far too forward on this radiator, whereas the original ones were set back more towards this hose, which means that the rear of the radiator is pushed towards the engine and it's hitting the engine, so can't use this now. I try and remain as philosophical about these kinds of things as I can. I've bought many new parts now that I can't use. It's unfortunate I cut the bits off, I can't even sell this one now, but what you've got to remain is solution focused rather than focusing on the problem itself. You've always got to think to yourself, what am I going to do to sort this problem out? Not actually think about the problem itself. You know got this gun, no ya! Just bought another one from Euro Car Parts. It looks a bit better, much thinner. Hey, the new radiator's in and fitted, but it still hits the engine. She's in. Bit of jiggery pokery with a fan cowl. All fits nicely now. Powered steering's working fine. Heater pipes are nice and hot, it's well bled now. Just waiting for the radiator fans to kick in. Look at that, on cue. Alternator's charging. Well, that just about wraps up part 19. Thanks very much for watching. It went on a bit, didn't it? It's only ruthless determination, you know, that's allowed me to get as far as I have with this project. And it reminds me of a story my old pops told me when I was a little lad. He sat me down and he gave me a life lesson. He was a shop owner and he said, "Pops, he say, life is like a newsagent. You have all these things to tempt you. The Yorkie bar and the cream soda, they are easy. But the finer things in life, the box of milk tray and the dirty books, they are on the top shelf. You have to reach for them.